Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Virtual Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Hammer Public Programs, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's talk by art historian John Walsh. Today is part one in a series of 6 talks in which Walsh will discuss drawings, paintings, and etchings by the great artist Rembrandt van Rijn. Part of the talks will focus on Rembrandt works that live right here in Southern California in the collections of our wonderful museums, including the Hammer, the Getty, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Huntington Library, and the Norton Simon Museum. In fact, one of the reasons we asked John Walsh to do this series is to encourage all Angelinos to get out and explore all the treasures Los Angeles has to offer. Of course, as of today, Los Angeles museums are closed due to the COVID pandemic, but I'm very optimistic that museums will reopen soon, and hopefully you'll all be inspired to visit some Rembrandt works around the city once it's safe to do so. John Walsh is a renowned independent art historian. He was the director of the J. Paul Getty Museum from 1983 until 2000. After graduating from Yale and getting his PhD from Columbia, he worked as a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and he taught art history at Columbia and Harvard. Since he left the Getty, he's been teaching part-time at Yale and giving public lectures there. Last fall, he gave a 3-lecture series at the Hammer on Vincent van Gogh, which is currently available on the Hammer website, and I highly recommend watching that too. Walsh is the author of many articles and catalogs on Dutch paintings of the 17th century, and of several books, including Jan Steen, The Drawing Lesson, and the J. Paul Getty Museum and its Collections, a museum for the new century. He currently serves on the boards of the Yale University Art Gallery and of the Hammer Museum. Each of Walsh's 6 talks will focus on one aspect of Rembrandt's work. Today's talk will focus on Rembrandt's early years and training in Leiden, and how in his 20s he became Amsterdam's finest portrait painter, attracting the admiration of leading connoisseurs and patrons. Next Sunday at 2 o'clock, Walsh will talk about the narratives in Rembrandt's work and how Rembrandt used composition, poses, gestures, and dramatic lighting to get to the heart of whatever story he painted. So if you enjoyed today's lecture, please be sure to RSVP for that. And after today's talk, he'll be happy to take audience questions, and you'll be able to write them in the chat window on your screen. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming John Walsh.
Thanks, Claudia. I'm really glad to be back at the Hammer, or so to speak, because I'm actually at home, not too far away. And so welcome to you all to my study. I've called this series of talks Rembrandt Here and Now. By here, I mean here in Los Angeles, because I'll be showing you quite a surprising number of pictures by Rembrandt that are in the area for you to go and see. And the now is not because you can run out now and see them because museums are closed at the moment. But now is a good time to catch up on what's been learned about Rembrandt in recent years. And that's quite a great deal. Rembrandt was the dominant artist in the Dutch culture of the so-called Golden Age that I studied as a graduate student, and he still is. My teachers more or less agreed on the qualities that made Rembrandt important: his skills, his knowledge, his goodness, his candor, his independence from fashion. My Dutch friends recognized Rembrandt as one of them. They saw their own national virtues embodied in him, their own best selves. Like their parents and their grandparents, they had been brought up with the idea that he was not only a great artist, but also a kind of moral hero as well. The picture of Rembrandt has changed since then. Scholars have helped us learn more about his business affairs, his patrons, the web of connections among the people in his circle, and about his social aspirations. We're more aware now of the sources of his inspiration. His ambitions as an artist are clearer, and so are the careers of the many pupils he taught in his busy studio. We've come to see his dealings with people that he didn't always have the generosity of spirit that he'd been credited with. His huge output of drawings and etchings has been restudied, and for most of these 50 years, the Rembrandt Research Committee examined just about every painting and tried to define what he did and didn't paint, resulting in a corpus of paintings that runs to 6 volumes and about 60 pounds. The number of pictures attributed to Rembrandt in the catalogs that I'd used as a student was initially cut in half by the committee. And then in the past 20 years, the trend reversed, and dozens of paintings that had been downgraded or under suspicion were reinstated in the corpus. And quite a few previously unknown paintings by Rembrandt have come to light. For these talks, I've chosen topics that I found particularly interesting, some of them tied up with my own studies of Rembrandt, and I'm very lucky to be able to say, with acquiring works by him. We'll look at what's been learned about the artist, what's been claimed, and what's been refuted by dozens of academics and curators. And we'll encourage you, when sooner or later you go back to museums, to look at the pictures slowly and up close, so that you make the guards nervous. Today we look at the launch of Rembrandt's career as the most accomplished painter in Leiden and then in Amsterdam. This portrait gives you an idea of how talented he was at the age of 25 and how he seized opportunity when it arose for him in Amsterdam. Let's just look at it for a few minutes. I'm going to show you a few details, things that you can see for yourself at the Getty, where it's on loan from the LA County Museum. I won't comment. I'm just going to look with you. This is the Amsterdam merchant, Martin Loten, holding what looks like a letter with his name on it and the date, January 11th, 1632, and a lot of pretend writing. The idea of the pose is that a man of stature in the world has taken time from his busy, profitable life to look at us, and to do that for posterity, for all to see and remember him by. Loten had his portrait painted in Rembrandt's place of business, a studio in the house of Hendrik Arlenburg, who is his dealer and his agent, and soon to be his father-in-law. In order to please clients like this, Loten, Rembrandt first of all had to meet the expectations that other portrait painters had established. The picture had to resemble you and convey your status in the world. And all the better if the artist could give the spectator a sense of being in the actual presence of the clients, to give him the illusion of life. Rembrandt makes Loten contract his forehead a bit and part his lips as though to speak. The lighting and the pose and props emphasize that the man's personality and a man of consequence. And if it's a woman, a person of virtue and sympathy. Here's an example of what an Amsterdam client might have expected a few years before Rembrandt arrived. This is Paulus Moreelse painting a well-born man dressed in extremely expensive clothes, using a meticulous technique, giving him, as you can see, a conventional pose, a bland expression, and very little animation in the face. Here's a portrait of a woman Rembrandt painted in the same year. Again, let's just look. I'm sure you saw how exact the whole thing is, how carefully detailed her costume and her features are. Here's where coming close pays off. You realize that what appears from a distance to be in sharp focus is not so sharp. The furrows of her forehead, for instance, and the corners of her eyes are just strokes of gray, and you can see. The lighter parts of her face have a kind of pebbly texture. The highlights on her nose are thicker, and they're touches of white. The more you look, the more active the surface seems. Now, here's the head of a somewhat younger woman by the older and very competent painter Nicholas Elias. Pretty much the same pose, same costume, same color range, and a pleasant but sober expression. But just look at the cheeks and the foreheads. One smooth with a bit of gloss. The other, by Rembrandt, the distinctive textures that he produced by a buildup of paint that he didn't smooth over. And look again at the shadow on the cheek and draw in both of those. And both of them invaded by light that reflects up from the rough. The one on the left is uniform. Rembrandt seems to shimmer. Rembrandt delivers all the clarity that people were accustomed to paying for, plus a lot of subtle virtuosity in the painting to linger over and admire. Now, this is not the more familiar Rembrandt of the late years, his portrait at the left on Marguerite de Geer, almost 30 years later, with its terrific directness and somber setting and thickly applied paint, and the sense of a message intended for us about morality and mortality and dignity. This is the young Rembrandt we're looking at, the Rembrandt of refined delicacy. At the same time, there's a strength in the level candor of the gaze that she gives us. And he paints an aureole of light around her, and he makes the background darken above her. This adds a subtle sense of drama and importance to her portrait, as modest as it is. Rembrandt knew this woman. She was a niece of Hendrik Eulenburg, the well-connected art dealer to whom Rembrandt lent 1,000 guilders in these days, and with whom he formed a business partnership. This woman, Altje, had a 21-year-old cousin called Saskia Eulenburg. And in the following year, Rembrandt was engaged to her. His drawing records their betrothal and salary and Saskia's birthday. The next year, they were married. This was both a love match and a good career move, because he moved into a very large, well-to-do family that gave him access to a clientele that was linked together by their merchant status and often their religious affiliations. This wasn't the uppermost crust of Amsterdam society, but these were people with money, usually recently earned, and on their way up. Many of them lived in Eulenburg's neighborhood, which is recently built up with fine houses. That's where the red arrow points. The city was expanding outward from its medieval core in the blue circle there, with the Dam Square and the new church in the center. Amsterdam had been booming, especially in these last 20-odd years during a truce with Spain that effectively ended the War of Independence between the rebel northern provinces that became the Dutch Republic and their overlord, the Spanish monarchy. The Dutch became a major power, with Amsterdam as their commercial metropolis, surpassing Antwerp in the southern Netherlands. On the waterfront there at the bottom, you can see a vast number of small vessels that traded on the North Sea and the Baltic, as well as the big three-masted merchantmen that went out to the East Indies, where they often made huge profits and brought them home. Banking and stock exchange made it the financial capital of Northern Europe. Fortunes were made. Disposable incomes were growing. Construction followed suit. And even middle-class Dutch people were buying works of art. It was the city for an ambitious artist. Eulenburg lived up here, where you see the red arrow again, in a mixed neighborhood that was becoming a magnet for artists and artisans. Running through it was Broadway, the Breestraat, which was renamed a century later the Jodenbreestraat after the well-to-do Jewish population that lived and worked there. And down lower right, the yellow arrow is pointing to the weigh house, the weighing house that was soon to get a large painting by Rembrandt. Eilenberg was a dealer in paintings. He handled older art and was also an agent for contemporary artists, a kind of go-between and business getter for them. And there was a studio in his house. Rembrandt became a boarder in the house and the head of the studio. His work in Leiden during the previous 4 years had already gotten him some notice, especially his small history paintings. In fact, several of them had actually been bought for the court of the stadtholder in The Hague, Prince Frederick Hendrik, such as this small scene of Pluto abducting a very unwilling Proserpina and plunging them down to the underworld with her in his chariot. The action is lively, the craftsmanship brilliant, and the surfaces jewel-like. So Rembrandt now is 25. How did he get so far so fast? I'm going to flash back for a few minutes to his years in Leiden. Leiden was the second largest city after Amsterdam, but much smaller. His father was a well-to-do miller. You can see his grain mill there in the blue circle, right on the Rhine, which cuts through the city. He milled malt for the brewing business, which was lucrative and respectable. And his father had married above his station, so Rembrandt went to the Latin school through his high school years. That's it, the one with the stepped gable in the picture. You can go and look at the building nowadays, although the school has moved on and there's a computer software company in that building. There he studied classical literature, the Bible, and history. At the age of 14 and 15, he registered in Leiden University and then studied drawing and painting with Jacob van Swartzenberg, a Leiden artist who had worked for many years in Italy. Rembrandt learned enough after a few years to go to Amsterdam and work under Peter Lastman, which was a much more important artist. In fact, Lastman was the perfect teacher if you wanted to be a history painter, which is what talented and ambitious artists wanted to be. Lastman had worked in Italy, and he'd observed the revolutionary changes in Venetian and Roman painting in the early 17th century. Lastman was an expert in composition, what the Dutch called ordonnantie, clear, legible arrangements of figures, which you can see in small paintings like this one, which is a scene from a play by Aeschylus in which two close friends argue about which of them is going to get to sacrifice himself for the sake of the other. Lastman had made a market for high-minded subjects from the Bible or classical writers, and he showed Rembrandt how to give his figures solid, believable physiques and poses and clear gestures and vivid expressions, and how to use classical-looking props and costumes and backgrounds. Lastman painted the picture on the top while Rembrandt may still have been in the studio with him. The general Coriolanus, during a siege, was being begged for mercy by his own mother and wife and other women kneeling on the ground before him. Rembrandt adapted that composition for one of his own, set in classical antiquity, but exactly what subject it represents has been debated for years. Just recently, it was identified as the two friends Orestes and Pylades, but at a moment nobody had ever thought to paint, from a version of the story where the king asks which of them is Orestes. And Pylades says he is, but a witness who knows who's who objects to that. And that would be the man standing at the right and raising his hand. And the point being that Rembrandt's picture is not incoherent, it was people were claiming, but explicit once you know the story that he had in mind. Half a dozen unknown early pictures by Rembrandt have come to light in the recent years. since the 1970s, the most recent being this auction item that turned up maybe 4 years ago, that shows the scene in the Gospels when Christ tells his disciples that rather than turning away the poor and needy, they should allow the little children to come to him. The attribution to Rembrandt was doubted at the sale, but there were tantalizing Rembrandt-like things about it. Here with the arrows, several figures are pure Rembrandt, including a self-portrait at the top and the old woman who appears in an etching by Rembrandt. The dealer who bought the picture had a hunch that it had been painted over in the 17th century to improve it and finish it. The overpaint was only partly removed when I last checked and got this image. It was shown in an exhibition in Leiden and Oxford last year as a work of Rembrandt himself, which is probably what it is. Like Glassman, Rembrandt worked on small panels and pretty quickly learned how to use a subtler range of colors. He gave his actors a whole repertory of exaggerated expressions. And in the scene on the right of Christ driving out the money changer from the temple, the emotions are pretty obvious: anger, fear, pain. The old man at the bottom with the beard seems to, the guy who's holding his grip on the money at the bottom, seems to have been based on a drawing that's in the Getty Museum now, one of the studies that Rembrandt made to get the pose and the beard right. In the case here of the old Tobit, the man on the left, the impoverished, pious, blind Tobit, his situation in the story calls for a display of pathos. His wife Anna has been to the market and brought back a goat, and Tobit is convinced that she must have stolen it. He's in despair, and she's astonished. It's kind of a trivial incident in a long, rich story, but it's a good demonstration of the power that Rembrandt quickly developed to paint convincing poses and expressions. Facial expression was his closest study in these years. He looked in the mirror and he recorded his own face over and over. He studied himself with more persistence than any artist ever had. The main purpose seems to have been to build his skills at expressing emotion. But there's some play acting too, a kind of trying on of identities, which we'll discuss in a later talk. In the upper left, it's a shock to see that he's given his own features to a miserable-looking beggar. In the lower right, he's a soldier wearing neck armor that we're going to see again. He had a talented colleague in Leiden for a couple of years, Jan Lievens, who seems to have had a working partnership with him. Lievens also painted his own face a good many times, and that's the upper right, painted his friend too. That's Rembrandt in the right. For a few years, it's hard to tell the unsigned painting of one artist from the others. This is a large panel that shows the Israelite heroine Esther revealing to the king the treachery of his trusted minister Haman at the left. For a long time, the picture was attributed to Rembrandt, and then to a combination of both artists, and now the consensus is Lievens alone painted it. Rembrandt was more and more ambitious in his last years in Leiden, especially as a painter of narrative scenes of myth and scripture. The little painting on the left shows a solitary artist, maybe Rembrandt himself, facing a huge panel painting, as though it were David sizing up Goliath. We can't see what he's painting. Whatever it is, Rembrandt makes this picture an idealized image of a confrontation of brave youth and the great unknown. The drawing on the right may well represent Lievens. He's also facing a challenge. a large round-top panel on the easel of a type we'll see of more shortly. He looks at it intently. In both these images, the artist pauses to take in his whole composition, not merely painting away at it, but judging, forming ideas, not executing, but thinking. And this advertises a more elevated idea of an artist's task than sitting and painting. Rembrandt's power of expression impressed Constantijn Huygens, the private secretary to the Prince of Orange, who was a learned connoisseur and something of a talent spotter. Huygens was the first person to write about Rembrandt's abilities. In his diary of 1629 or 30, he mentions two young artists in Leiden who were barely 3 years into their careers. Rembrandt surpasses Levens, says Huygens, in his sure touch and in the liveliness of emotions. Conversely, Levens is superior in invention and in a certain grandeur of his daring themes and forms. Huygens was taken by Rembrandt's painting of the repentant Judas, and he wrote this amazing passage about it. The singular gesture of the despairing Judas, that one furious Judas, howling, praying for mercy, but devoid of hope, all traces of hope erased from his countenance, his appearance frightening, his hair torn, his garments rent, his limbs twisted, his hands clenched bloodlessly tight, fallen prostrate on his knees on a blind impulse, his whole body contorted in wretched hideousness. I place this against all the elegance that has been produced throughout the ages. So Huygens goes on to say he's amazed that a youth, a Dutchman, a beardless miller, could bring together so much in one human figure and express it all. He believed that Rembrandt had the faculty of penetrating to the heart of his subject and bringing out its essence. Rembrandt put his finger on qualities in Rembrandt that were going to distinguish him for 40 more years, particularly that skill at finding in a story the emotional and moral center of gravity and expressing it. A year or so later, Rembrandt got a commission to paint a portrait of Amalia van Solms, the wife of the stadtholder, Prince Frederick Hendrik, who was the chief executive, you could say, and commander-in-chief of the Dutch Republic. Rembrandt must have spent some months in The Hague. Here on the right, you see the prince riding out in red, wearing red, and had gotten at least a taste of life at court, which was insular, French-speaking, and small potatoes compared to the commercial metropolis of Amsterdam. The portrait was evidently to be a companion piece to her husband's portrait on the left by Gerard van Honthorst, posed in profile like the emperors and the empresses on Roman coins. Not exactly a format that allowed a show of feeling by the princess or much virtuosity by Rembrandt either. But his great life-size portrait, painted in 1631, had been a powerful demonstration of just those qualities. This man, Nicholas Rutz, was a merchant who traded with Russia, which probably accounts for his fur hat and his conspicuous fur trim on his overgarment, which is called a tabard, and was worn by academics and by clergymen and other people of distinction, or people who wanted to claim distinction for themselves. Rembrandt shows him turning toward us and holding out a slip of paper, making the point that he's a man of affairs. His forehead is a bit contracted as he gives his whole attention to the spectator. His face is patiently finished, but everywhere you can see signs of the painter's energy. He paints the fur with flicks of a wide, soft brush, And he makes the wiry hairs of the mustache by gouging the wet paint with the butt of the brush. The whole effect is one of mental and physical forcefulness, subdued for long enough to make a likeness. Well, when Rembrandt wasn't doing portraits, he continued to paint historical subjects on the small scale that Constantijn Huygens and evidently the Prince of Orange favored. The Prince bought the picture here on the screen a few years earlier, perhaps after his scout Huygens had seen it in his Leiden studio. Rembrandt did another version of the subject, very different, doing away with the close-up intimacy and instead pulling back to present a scene that is breathtaking in its theatrical setting and lighting. He invents a kind of vast temple of Jerusalem that's a dizzy Semitic Gothic fantasy swarming with tiny figures. A beam of light from somewhere off stage picks out the old rabbi and the Holy Family. The light becomes a kind of messenger of divine revelation to the Jews who aren't actually paying all that much attention. Simeon's robe shimmers and seems translucent. Now, that robe may have been one of Rembrandt's purchases around this time, since he was an avid buyer of costumes and exotic props of all kinds, which he used for biblical and historical scenes like this one, and also for single figures. For instance, this one, this imposing figure at the Met, his gorgeous outfit has recently been recognized as Turkish. Pictures like this weren't commissioned portraits or just costume pieces. They were also exercises in pose and expression, and also in various kinds of lighting and in techniques of painting rich fabric and metalwork and arms and armor and so on. They also served as examples for his pupils who made copies or variations on Rembrandt's pictures or used them for entire compositions in his style. They belong to a category that the Dutch called tronie, a single figure in exotic or military outfit with no specific historical identity. There are a great many tronies by Rembrandt and his pupils mentioned in 17th century archives. There's a prime example here at the Getty Museum that you can inspect closely, and you can see how skillful the impression is of shifting light and atmosphere, how the steel armor gleams softly, and up close, how finely painted the face is. The expression is a touch stagey, but his eyes and his contracted brow all add up to something, add up to impression of apprehension, maybe tinged with fear. The male model in the Met picture also posed for a kind of imaginary portrait of St. Peter, identified by the keys he's clutching. What sets this Peter apart is the intensity of his expression. He's clearly troubled, and for a reason. The core of Peter's story is his repentance after he betrayed Christ. His expression is all the more striking when you compare it to the other great painter of tronies and saints, his older contemporary in Antwerp, Peter Paul Rubens. Rubens's Peter wears white. It's papal white because he's the first pontiff of the church, and he attends entirely to God above, not to us fellow humans. The image is about sanctity and authority. Rembrandt's image is about guilt. His Peter focuses his guilty and disturbed mind on the viewer, as if he were asking for our understanding of his weakness. 30 years later, Rembrandt painted a series of apostles in the same format, but now using his most thickly built-up style of painting with broad strokes of the brush. Here, St. Bartholomew holds the instrument of his martyrdom, the knife that was used to skin him alive. His pensive state of mind is something that we can't really fathom, only try to guess at. Rembrandt kept on painting small narrative paintings. This one is hardly more than 2 feet wide. And I have to say, it's the picture I have the greatest feeling for. When I worked at the Metropolitan Museum, I was very conscious that we had no early narrative paintings by Rembrandt. And this one was the best one in private hands anywhere. And I wanted it in the worst way. I wanted to borrow it from the cranky elderly Swiss owner who had it, but he wouldn't talk to me. My successor, Walter Liedtke, managed to pry it away. And in the early 1990s, it was alone at the Met, where some of you saw it, covered with yellow varnish, but in wonderful condition. Meanwhile, I'd moved on to a museum that needed the picture even more than the Met, and eventually we got it. After a judicious cleaning, the painting looked the way Rembrandt intended. And I want to look at it with you for just a moment. The story here is from Ovid. It's how Europe got its name. The Princess Europa of Tyre in modern Lebanon, wandering in a meadow, encountered an attractive white bull, Jupiter in disguise, of course, who was so beguiling that she accepted his invitation and got up on his back for a ride. The ride was longer than she expected, despite her protests, all the way to the island of Crete. And there, with a lot of help from Jupiter, she bore a great many important children. Rembrandt imagines her handmaidens theatrically distraught, and a Moorish driver and an astonishing golden wagon, which would have looked at home parked outside Rembrandt's Temple of Jerusalem. It's supposed to be happening on the Eastern Mediterranean, but this looks more like a Dutch river with a fortified town of fantastic antiquity. Rembrandt pulls off some feats of illusion here, like the ripply water, with colorful, woozy reflections of the bull and his passengers. There are delightful details, like Europa's expression of mild regret while she keeps a tight grip on his hide and horn, and the bull's eager gaze toward the future, his tail erect with excitement. It's a sure thing that some paintings like this were commissioned rather than painted on spec, but we rarely know which ones. We assume that Eilenberg's house served as a place where portrait sitters and visitors could look at paintings and etchings by Rembrandt on display and buy them, or order them, for example, biblical subjects like this one, the raising of Lazarus. We'll return to both of these in a later talk. At this point in his 20s, Rembrandt was doing well. He was getting ahead in his lucrative portrait practice. He was selling history paintings with small figures in the meticulous style that he'd perfected in Leiden. He'd sold pictures to the Prince of Orange, and he was getting serious about etching. His great leap forward, though, came when he got a commission, probably through Eilenberg, from an Amsterdam physician, a prominent man, Dr. Nicholas Tulp, the celebrated surgeon and anatomist who wanted a portrait of the group of colleagues with Tulp himself shown as their teacher, demonstrating the anatomy of the body. It was intended for this building, the headquarters of the Surgeons Guild, upstairs in the St. Antoniswaag, a medieval gatehouse converted to a weighing house. It's 5 minutes walk from Eilenberg's house. This wouldn't be the first time ever that a teacher had been portrayed dissecting a cadaver. Dissections were public events. Teachers performed them in an anatomical theater, a small theater in the round, where the dissected corpses of recently executed criminals were carved up in front of all kinds of spectators. Here in Mirafelt's picture, The doctors surround Dr. van der Meer here in the center with a knife as he proceeds by opening the abdominal cavity first, in the sequence prescribed by Vesalius in his book on anatomy, human anatomy of 70 years before. Rembrandt took this stale kind of yearbook picture formula and turned it into something thrilling. We're not in an anatomical theater, but instead in a shadowy, vaulted building, more like the cave of Lazarus. Tulp is not dissecting in the prescribed way. He's opened up the arm so that others can see how the limb and the hand work, how the tendons make the fingers move. It's a demonstration of the ingenious machinery of the body, mastered by Vesalius, who, by the way, was from the Netherlands. He was baptized Andries van Wezel. Vesalius, who was surely the author of the big book that's propped there on the lower right. Dr. Tulp's calling in life is to expound this knowledge to his followers. And they react with expressions of surprise, excitement, doubt, wonderment. Each pose and face different, each vivid. Calm, though, is Tulp. Tulp is utterly calm, and he's also speaking to well-educated people. Well-educated people looking at the painting. Vesalius must have come immediately to mind by Rembrandt's group portrait. Some would have seen this picture of Vesalius in his great treatise and perhaps remembered how he chose to be pictured, showing how the arm and hand work. Just what Tulp had Rembrandt do, to paint a demonstration of Tulp's own mastery of that knowledge. By extension, humans' mastery of nature, and more than that, of Tulp himself as inheritor and transmitter of that mastery. Rembrandt's portrait practice surged. Some of his clients belonged to the clergy in Eilenberg Circle, liberal Calvinists, Mennonites, and Remonstrants. This was the most famous and important of all of them. A 76-year-old man called Johannes Uitenboogaert, a preacher who had been tutor to the Prince of Orange and a hero to moderates during the struggles between Calvinist sects, and now returned from self-imposed exile. Rembrandt gives him a familiar gesture of heartfelt conviction, hand on his heart, and it emphasizes the heavy line on his face that seemed to be the record of his spiritual struggles. Uitenboogaert noted in his diary that he sat for Rembrandt for just one day, and that couldn't have been enough time for Rembrandt to do more than just sketch the whole composition and paint his face. Since the hands are relatively crude, the assumption is that he had help from assistants, and that's certainly true of a good many of Rembrandt's portraits. One pupil of Rembrandt's noted that Rembrandt asked his portrait sitters to bring a collar or a ruff and leave them in the studio after their sitting, which does solve the puzzle of how he managed to paint something as intricate and subtle as this man's collar in the very short time that he had. Answer, he didn't. He painted it later. In another category altogether are the marriage portraits of Martin Solmans and Opien Koppit, life-sized. She was from a rich and socially prominent family, marrying for the second time. She steps toward her betrothed, who proudly shows the glove that he's accepted from her father, which was a conventional symbol at the time for the groom's acceptance of authority over the woman he's marrying. Well, getting painted like this, life-size and full length, had been the prerogative of highborn people, but in Rembrandt's time, things were changing, and some merely rich people had begun to commission full lengths and to buy houses with the wall space that would hold them, or build houses like that. This This man, for example, was a cloth dealer in Haarlem called Willem van Heithhuizen, who paid Frans Hals to give him the full treatment, including a sword, and the cloth of honor behind him, and a Renaissance garden. They were social climbers everywhere, but very few had the cheek to present themselves as grandly as Heithhuizen in full length. The couple is dressed in spectacularly expensive and showy outfits. On top of that, their actions get the message across, which hasn't got so much to do with personality or mutual attraction, but everything to do with their family alliance and their standing in the world. Other sitters wanted other things from Rembrandt, including some movement and even excitement. The young woman at the right at the mat turns in her chair to look at us. Over the years, her portrait, though, was separated from her husband's. So we've lost Rembrandt's brilliant invention here, which was to have her husband lunge forward, rising out of his chair, gesturing to her as she turns away as though in modesty. Rembrandt sticks to the convention of having each of them look at the spectators, which of course limits what they can express for each other. Actually, I think I was the first to bring these two portraits back together, but only temporarily. In an exhibition I did of Dutch pair portraits at the Metropolitan, where I had the matching frames made for them, which they still wear whenever they have conjugal visits, as they were having at the Met a couple of years ago when I took this cell phone picture. Her portrait is both more beautifully painted and in better condition, but still, when they're put together, they generate excitement, and both portraits make more sense. Rembrandt had some legal business in Rotterdam in 1634, and during his stay, he painted this portrait of a brewer and art collector, a man called Dirk Passer, that's in the Los Angeles County Museum. It is completely conventional in its composition and in its grave reserve, but it does hint at complexities in the mind of the man, I think, and there are many small irregularities that you see when you look close up. Passer's wife, Haasje, was 4 years older. She got her portrait painted at the same time. It's too bad that these two have been separated too, since in contrast to her husband, her face and costume are so much more tightly painted and so smooth and shiny with reflected light. Now, in addition to the married couple, Rembrandt painted this portrait on the left of an 83-year-old woman who was evidently Dirk Passer's mother, and it's one of the really unforgettable faces from this period. Rembrandt used a different technique for her face there, a thick, irregular kind of application of paint. We've seen him use it before, but never in a commissioned portrait. One eyelid droops a little bit. Her face is a mass of ridges and furrows, carved in relief with the brush. It's an amazing forward look, 30 years or so, to Rembrandt's late style. This couple has never been separated. This is a shipbuilder in the act of drawing a ship's hull, which you see on the table, one of those fast and roomy merchant vessels that carried much of the Dutch overseas trade. His wife reaches out, still holding the door handle, as she makes her delivery, and she opens her mouth as if to speak to him. This is a new and different kind of portrait of a marriage. It's a portrait of an active partnership, the couple engaged with each other, and the wife creating the action. When I was a student, we had no idea who these people were, but then the Amsterdam archivist, Isa van Egen, managed to identify them. They are the very successful master shipbuilder, Jan Rijksen, and his wife, Grietje Jans. They were both investors in the Dutch East India Company, think early investors, so think Microsoft in the 70s. who had the highest tax bill of anybody living in the shipyard district. Recently, a 19th century engraving has been found that tells us something important about how the picture once looked. It looked taller, with more headroom. Analysis of the canvas confirmed that it has indeed been cut down. Now, by whom and why, we don't know. And the space is now a lot more compressed than Rembrandt intended. Here's another pair. And again, we have only the man in Los Angeles. The wife has slipped away elsewhere, as you'll see. But it's quite powerful in itself, luminous in the half shadows, clear-eyed, candid. It seems likely that this man is Peter Schijn, who was a merchant in Amsterdam and who had business with Rembrandt's partner, Hendrik Uilenburg. You drive up to Pasadena, you can compare it with a very similar oval portrait of Dirk Passer that we saw earlier. Here's Passer and Schijn together. Rembrandt painted Schijn's wife in the following year, painted her in a slightly submissive pose with mild features, placid and scrupulously painted. Saskia Uilenburg often served as model for Rembrandt before and after their marriage. Here are two pictures of Saskia in fancy dress. On the right, with a big hat and a feather and a coquettish smile, not intended as a portrait, but again, what contemporaries called a tronie, intended for the market, probably via the family dealer, Uilenburg. And on the left, she's dressed in a gorgeous Arcadian or maybe shepherdess outfit with a staff and holding a mass of flowers. She probably represents Flora, the goddess of gardens. This is another picture that underwent major changes long after it left the studio. X-rays, which mainly show the lead white that artists used, have revealed a welter of form on the right side here that doesn't match quite what we see on the surface of the painting, which was obviously painted over some earlier design. In fact, if you look hard at it, you can see that at the level of Flora's shoulder, there's a head in profile, and below that, a kind of scoop of drapery. Researchers in London showed that Rembrandt's gentle Flora began life as Judith, the Israelite heroine who seduced Holofernes, the invading Babylonian general, got him drunk, and then cut his head off. She's often pictured doing the cutting or else handing the head off to her maidservant, which is exactly what she's doing in Rubens's painting here at the lower right. You can verify the fact that Rembrandt was thinking about this subject by looking at the drawing at the top, which includes the bed with the headless corpse and the kneeling maid stuffing the head into the bag. It's quite a change. She first held a sword in her right hand, which Rembrandt painted out and replaced with a staff with ivy on it. The severed head and the maid are gone, but her expression remains. The calm killer Judith becomes the fertile Flora without moving a muscle. We have no idea why Rembrandt made the change, but it's easy to imagine a client in the studio seeing the Judith and asking for something, well, maybe a bit more pleasant. I want to return to Rembrandt's admirer, Constantin Huygens, and his boss, Frederick Hendrik, the Prince of Orange, whose court in The Hague was responsible for another commission by Rembrandt and Jan Lievens. It was for the prince's cousin. Also, can you remember this from earlier, the picture of Frederick Henry and his commission of the abduction of Proserpina. This was for the cousin who is called Frederick, also Frederick V, however, Elector Palatinate of the Rhine and the deposed king of Bohemia, and his queen, Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of King James I of England. They were in Holland as refugees and as celebrities. Frederick, the wistful man dressed as an ancient Roman emperor, had been offered the crown of Bohemia and accepted it, which was not a good idea because he couldn't speak Czech. And being a Protestant, he was soon undermined by the Catholic nobles of Bohemia and defeated by the invading army of the Holy Roman Emperor. He was king for a year, hence his famous nickname, the Winter King. He fled Bohemia to The Hague, bringing his queen and 6 children and the crown jewels with him. Frederick was mocked in satirical prints and in serious one. You see them here after their arrival, and you see now as well some of their possessions. Mainly their stock in trade was children. They commissioned from Rembrandt and Lievens this remarkable pair of portraits of their 2 eldest boys, the heirs to the rickety throne of Bohemia. Extraordinary because they're pictured as historical figures. On the left, Charles Louis is dressed up as the young Alexander the Great, robed in gold and crowned with laurel, being taught by his real-life tutor, who's cast as Aristotle, who was Alexander's teacher. Lievens makes Aristotle look out at us, inviting us to consider his pupil Alexander and the enormous book that he's been studying, while the kid looks away into the distance as though to the future, to his own glorious future. Rembrandt's Prince Rupert is dressed in a turban and Middle Eastern costume. He's been given the role of the young prophet Samuel, who was tutored by the venerable high priest Eli, and himself grew to be a great prophet. Rembrandt makes the action more literal. Eli points to a passage, and his pupil Samuel absorbs it. Lievens finished his picture by himself, while Rembrandt probably got help from one of several of the younger pupils in his studio, almost certainly this one, Gerard Dow, particularly in painting the wonderfully smooth face of Rupert. Rembrandt himself probably did the rugged face you see on the left of the tutor. It's been suggested recently that when Rembrandt left Amsterdam in 1631 to set up a new studio, left from Leiden to Amsterdam, he left Lievens in Leiden to supervise the commission that remained to be carried out. When I was a student, this painting by Rembrandt was rediscovered in an unexpected place, a parish church in a town near Bordeaux, representing Christ on the cross and signed and dated 1631. It's a stark image of an isolated victim crying out to God at the 9th hour, "Why have you forsaken me?" Both Rembrandt and Lievens painted the same subject in the same year in a similar round-topped format. The Lievens is on the right. Since Huygens admired both artists, he may well have asked each of them to paint the same subject as a kind of competition, so he could compare them. The drawing you see by Rembrandt in the center might even record this. It shows an artist with the features of Lievens pondering a picture on the easel whose round-top shape is like the ones that he and Rembrandt had been painting. Both Rembrandt and Lievens owed their compositions to Rubens, who isolated Christ crying out to his Father. That was their prototype, we think, in a print that had been published in the same year. This is the moment actually to say a bit more about Peter Paul Rubens, whose name has already come up a few times and will again in lectures to come. That's because his career set such a dazzling example for Rembrandt, who was a generation younger. Rubens had greater powers of visualizing stories than any Northern artist ever had. He had a huge output of public and private works, aided by a team of assistants. He had printmakers to reproduce his work and disseminate it all over Europe. He was wealthy and lived like a prince in Antwerp. And he had admirers among Dutch connoisseurs in high places, including Constantijn Huygens. In any case, Rembrandt got a further commission from Huygens to paint 2 scenes of the Passion, which in turn led to a total of 7 paintings of the life of Christ in the same round-topped format, each about 3 feet high, a project that took him 7 years. The first one was this, the raising of the cross, which Rembrandt set in near darkness. You can pick out a mass of mostly faceless men pulling and shoving the cross up, watched by apostles and the centurion on horseback, who looks out at the picture as if commanding us to watch justice being done. The light falls on a few figures only, mainly on Christ and on a fashionably dressed young helper right in the center of the picture, who has the features of Rembrandt himself. The artist presents himself as an actual participant, a sinner who bears responsibility for what's happening. I'll say more about that in a moment. We assumed for a long time that Rembrandt had in mind the famous altarpiece by Rubens in the Antwerp Cathedral, but there's no evidence that he ever went there or that it was ever engraved, and besides, it's very different, not to mention being very much bigger. I show you the slide on the left just to give you an idea of the actual scale relationship between Rembrandt's painting and Rubens's enormous 15-foot altarpiece. It's also daylit, Rubens's picture, with swarming with muscle men. Christ is beautifully posed, a kind of idealized athletic figure. A better idea was proposed some time ago than Rubens, and that is this little woodcut by the German artist Albrecht Altdorfer. And it might have suggested a much simpler composition to Rembrandt. Like all great artists, Rembrandt was never too proud to borrow, and he often turned to Renaissance printmakers for ideas, to Dürer, to Lucas van Leyden, and a lot of others. Rembrandt made a preliminary chalk drawing that was good evidence that he was inspired by Altdorfer's composition. The second picture he delivered was this scene of the lowering of Christ from the cross, and at the bottom left, Christ's mother collapsed on the ground. Rembrandt imagines the corpse as a misshapen sack, greenish, with his features distorted, unmistakably tortured to death. This one is based on Rubens, as transmitted by this engraved copy, but everything that is noble and beautiful in Rubens becomes horrible in Rembrandt's adaptation. Rembrandt puts himself in the picture again. It had been suggested that the motive was to play the part of every man in the Middle Ages, the personification of all sinners. Now it's been proposed that there's a more particular reason for him to be there, especially for the educated audience that the picture was intended for. Just a few years earlier, a prominent Calvinist minister published a poem called "He Bore Our Sorrows" that describes all Christ's tortures in vivid detail. The poem says, "It was not the Jews, Lord Jesus, who crucified you. It is I, Lord, who have done all this to thee." This does seem to be the spirit and the purpose that led Rembrandt to paint himself as one of the executioners in the raising of the cross you saw before, and in this man receiving the corpse in the descent from the cross. The two crucifixion pictures got him a commission for 3 more scenes from the Passion. Those took him 6 more years. He exchanged letters about this with Huygens, who was evidently not at all pleased. And in one of the letters, in 1639, Rembrandt offers a celebrated excuse for the delay with the pictures. They did indeed take a long time, said Rembrandt, but the result was, I quote him, "In these 2 pictures, the greatest and most natural emotion and animation may have been observed, which is also the principal reason why they have been so long in the making." So Rembrandt was striving for emotion and animation in the translation that I just read you. The word Rembrandt used was bewegelijkheid, or movement. Dutch scholars have argued for years over what that meant. Movement, is that literally physical action? Or is it movement in the sense of being moved by what you see? Action or emotion? The consensus now would probably be that Rembrandt was adopting an idea from classical rhetoric, the function of which was to persuade the reader or listener by using an appeal to strong emotion. In other words, by moving the listener. Rembrandt's ability to depict emotions and arouse them in the viewer is just what you heard Huygens praise so lavishly in the Judas painting 7 or 8 years earlier. Whatever his excuse, these paintings were genuinely difficult for him, in part because of their small size, which he must have felt confining. He certainly wanted to prove himself with bigger things, as Rubens had. What followed after he finished the series, but hadn't yet been paid for the last 2 pictures, was a curious episode. He wrote this to Huygens. "As my lord has been troubled in these matters for a second time, a piece 10 feet wide and 8 feet high will be presented to my lord at his home." After Rembrandt learned that Huygens had doubts about accepting his gift of a 10-foot painting, this one, he wrote again saying that, "Against my lord's wish, I am sending this accompanying canvas, hoping that you will not decline it." He also requests that he get paid right away for the last 2 Passion pictures. And then he adds, the only other observation about his art on record. "My lord," he wrote Huygens, "my lord, hang this piece in a strong light so that one can stand at a distance. Then it will sparkle best." This picture, The Blinding of Samson, is definitely a piece to stand at a distance from. In Rembrandt's staging, Delilah's trick has worked. She's seduced the Israelite strongman, learned that his strength is in his hair, and has removed some. And she flees with it as the soldiers slam him to the ground and put out his eyes. It's graphically violent. It's as violent as the descent from the cross, and painted with a forceful design and great breadth. In fact, Rembrandt, now at the age of 30, had to see himself in a kind of contest with Rubens, the greatest painter of the previous generations. Rubens' version at the bottom, however, looks positively polite by comparison. He chooses the moment of the haircut before it ignites the action. In the painting at the right, Prometheus, Rubens's most horrific victim, is upside down and having his liver eaten by an eagle. Even Prometheus has a kind of elegance in his pose. That's the opposite of Rembrandt's ungainly Samson lying helpless on the ground. A detail to turn the stomach, the spurt of blood from Samson's eye, and the dagger being used to produce it. not a normal European weapon, but a wavy bladed Southeast Asian dagger called a kris, which seems somehow even worse. With this, I'm going to end. In the next talk, I'm going to pick up the thread and say more about what made Rembrandt such a brilliant success in Amsterdam. That was not just his portraits, but above all, it was his ability to choose important events in the Bible, history, the myth, and visualize them in powerful, memorable form. We'll look closely at this painting of the sacrifice of Isaac and many others besides. Be well in the meantime, and I'll be delighted to see you here again.
Wow. That was just absolutely incredible. John, I will definitely never look at a Rembrandt the same way again. Thank you so much. It was just completely edifying, brilliant, and utterly fascinating. I love it. Now I wish I could just take art history all the time with you as my instructor. It was brilliant. So for you in the audience, this is time now that we are going to do an audience Q&A, and we would love to take your questions. I will read them and pose them to John Walsh. If you do not know how to ask a question right now, let me explain it to you. So you need to type your question into the chat function in your viewer, and there's two ways to do it depending on which viewer you're using. If you are looking at a viewer where in the upper right corner you see a heart sign, then you'll see a speech bubble icon 2 over from the heart sign, and you click on that, and that's where you would type in your question. If you don't see anything in the upper right corner, then what you need to do is in the lower right corner, you'll see a sort of flag symbol, and you click on that, and it will say, view this in live stream. And you say, yes, you want to view it in live stream, and then you will magically be able to see the chat function in there. And that's where you type in your questions. So please go ahead and send us some questions. We have our first audience question coming in right now from John. He says, this remarkable presentation must have taken many hours of research and composition. It was brilliantly undertaken and delivered. Roughly, could you give the audience a sense of how long this work took you?
Wow, I think roughly 60 years. No, I got interested in Rembrandt in graduate school. If you study Dutch art, that's what you do. And so all along, I've been sort of keeping track, and I've written some essays about aspects of Rembrandt and individual pictures and worked on a catalog. Anyway, I have experience with the artist, and what I didn't ever have the chance to do was develop a kind of lecture series for intelligent adults, grown-ups who with an education and some travel and some curiosity. It was not, that's different from talking to undergraduates, I have to say. So, and furthermore, here's a confession. About a couple of years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I realized that I had slipped kind of behind with the Rembrandt literature. It doesn't take more than a few months to slip behind with the Rembrandt literature. There's so much of it. I thought, oh, it's time to catch up. And maybe if I catch up, I can package and present to a general audience some of the changes, some of the ways we don't quite think about Rembrandt the way we used to, and particularly a lot of discoveries that have been made in conservation laboratories with exotic equipment, and also just made with plain naked eye with a good deal of expertise. Documentary information. We just know a lot more about Rembrandt, and it's important that scholars do this work, because Rembrandt didn't help a lot with it. Rembrandt left very few words behind, and the commentary of people who looked at his work in the 18th and 19th century is often very rich and vivid, but often mistaken in its assumptions. So I thought it would be a good idea to bring Rembrandt forward with a view towards the newer information and the sort of changed attitudes towards him and assumptions. We always project back on older artists, attitudes we have about artists we admire in our own time. So we admire Rembrandt's abstract qualities, and we also inherit a predilection for psychologizing or to looking at portraits and assuming that they embody some profundities, or more important, some emotional states that the sitters who are having their portraits painted didn't have at all or may not have had. We're apt to confuse, for example, seriousness when we look at a Rembrandt portrait with gloominess. Anyway, there was a lot to report to you on, and I'm just getting started. So if you stick with me for 6 lectures, you'll see a whole lot that's not generally known about Rembrandt, and the mythology about Rembrandt is going to be a little bit weakened in all that. I hope that's okay with you.
And that's a great reminder that to RSVP for the upcoming lectures. You need to RSVP for each program separately, so please do. Now we have a question from Heather. Do we know how many assistants Rembrandt had or their names?
We know a lot of names. We don't have the number, that's varied, and surely there were more than are recorded. But there's got to be at least 15 or 18 artists whose name we know and who had careers after they left the Rembrandt studio. And there are mentions of others. It's a lot of people. The studio seems to have been full of people acting as assistants to Rembrandt in various menial categories, and also helping with the preparation of paintings that Rembrandt would then go ahead and finish. And you heard me make some reference to the odd state of affairs when we actually haven't done that yet. You must listen to the lecture on Rembrandt self-portraits, and I'll show you an example of an artist who copied a Rembrandt self-portrait. So it looks for all the world like a Rembrandt self-portrait, and we always thought it was until it wasn't, because a better version turned up in the storeroom of the Nuremberg Museum. So just to say, what Rembrandt did with his students in his studio is not what typically the Italians or even the Flemish artists like Rubens did. That is, use artists to make many replicas of his work and use them to take a picture that Rembrandt would then finish up to almost to completion. He doesn't seem to have used them as a workforce in quite that same way, although he did that sometimes. And he didn't have the same kind of systematic way of building up a picture by kind of geometrical layout and other things that could be mechanically transferred and the like. It was much more of it was a kind of academy. It's been called that. There's a terrific book by Svetlana Alpers, who taught at Berkeley, on Rembrandt's academy and the ways in which it sticks to a fairly well-worn, time-worn practice originating in Italy, in which you learn to draw as a group systematically, ultimately ending up in working on live models. I'm not sure it was quite that much, but it had that aspect. And there was a kind of diaspora from the studio that provided artists for the whole next generation and 2 generations. Hope that's helpful.
Sorry, got to unmute. So we have a couple of questions that take up what you and I were discussing earlier about Christian and Jewish imagery in Rembrandt's paintings. So there's two questions that are interconnected. From Anne, she says, in your comment about Rembrandt's painting himself into the descent from the cross painting, you suggest this painting suggests Rembrandt's faith was deep. Do you see that faith expressed over his lifetime? And in a related question from Tony, he says, how does Rembrandt visually reconcile Protestant and Catholic aesthetic considerations?
Yikes. I'm tempted to ask, how much time have you got? Because I could just make some remarks, maybe that would be helpful, just to sort of clear away some misapprehensions. I mean, Rembrandt was a believer in some broad and general sense, and actually had his children baptized in the Reformed Church, and but there were many other reasons that he went to the Bible, to the Old Testament, to the New Testament, to the life of Christ, for subject matter. And they have a great deal to do with, have little to do with worship. In that sense, he's a Protestant, not a Catholic. Little to do with worship, but a great deal to do with moral formation, what we would call character, strength in adversity, and also a good deal to do with sin. People who make mistakes, people who go wrong and can get themselves right. I think Rembrandt, much more than a preacher about Christianity, is more of a moralist and does not, certain subjects he doesn't treat at all. Things that are illustrations of the intercession of saints or the Blessed Virgin Mary. You know, images that are inducements to pray to those images in hope for help with the authorities upstairs. I mean, it was not that that he wanted to do. I think he had a broad general commitment to using art for moral instruction, but also a kind of real alert taste for amusing and pungent and unforgettable stories. I'm going to lay a lot of emphasis in this series on narrative, more than perhaps you are used to, on stories from the Bible and both the Old and New Testaments, and the Apocrypha, which took some digging around by Rembrandt. Stories, in other words, that were not the ones reproduced, or I should say, illustrated in books of the 16th century and other artists. There was a sort of recherche flavor to a good many of Rembrandt's choices of subjects, and that there's always a point to it. Sometimes the point is the extraordinary character of the individuals, but mostly these are stories in which somebody gets his comeuppance, somebody gets surprised in an unhappy way because of his bad behavior. I mean, the great story, for example, from the book of Esther about the fate of the king's servant. She, of course, was an Israelite who was the wife, actually, of the king. His servant unjustly accused one of the Israelites, and the king punished him. And the story is a suspenseful one. Rembrandt loved it and treated it several times. So, in other words, there was not anything theological, not much that's theologically weighty or that leads one to devotion. But there's a great deal that gives you thought about how you might live a life that is perhaps more like St. Paul, or that has the moral courage that is shown by the various saints. You saw today, I think, St. Bartholomew, and you saw a pensive St. Peter who's acting out his regret and contrition and pictured in a single image. So that's a little monologue, I'm afraid, that well, maybe connects both questions about Rembrandt's religious beliefs. And I'll have a lot more to say about this subject as we go along.
Fantastic. Well, I have a follow-up question. It's about the Passion series, which I think, can you just check, is that the 108 slide? KP is asking, why did the small Passion series take so long? And are there many studies and drawings that Rembrandt agonized over feeling, or is that specific series where he was the most emotionally intertwined with it?
It's a really good question. We don't really have a clear answer to it. And he had to do a lot of fudging and hedging and
Can you
ducking.
describe what it is? Or we could pull up the slide too. I'm going to bring up slide 108 because I think that's the slide it is.
Yeah, you're looking for, yes, and there's a detail of that slide. Sorry, all you peoples. Well, 115 is another image of Rembrandt himself.
Is this the
as the body is taken, that body is taken, this horrible, sickening image of Christ. I mean, you have to go to Germany to see the Isenheim altarpiece by Grunewald to see anything as horrible as this completely limp, boneless man tortured to death. But the pious person in the picture, and the only one really showing that kind of direct involvement with Christ's suffering, is the one who takes his body down and holds it from underneath. And that's Rembrandt's face. What's that about? I read you something that suggests that this was a kind of Protestant meditation. A poet wrote a passage in which the writer of the poet, the voice of the poet, says, it was I who did this to you. It was my sins that caused you to undergo the suffering. I'm paraphrasing. And so this is some fervent, and if it weren't Rembrandt's face, we would assume that's the story. But Rembrandt's there, and it does seem to profess a kind of personal, response to the Passion in a way that acknowledges the universal responsibility of sinners, he included, with Christ's death and the necessity of salvation. And this is not the only portrait of himself as a sinner. He turns up as a little later than this, just at the time when he's trying to finish the rest of the series. He shows up in a painting of himself using his wife as a model, and as well as himself, maybe his wife, as the prodigal son, drinking in an inn and welcoming you in. So Rembrandt acknowledges his own sinfulness twice in this series. The very good question was, how come he didn't get on with it? You would think, if he's working for the stadtholder and the Prince of Orange and the court, he, just in the interest of getting more business, he would paint more pictures or paint those faster. As you heard, he did paint a great big painting that was more like the style he wanted to practice kind of in competition with Rubens, a kind of large-scale biblical narrative, and he wanted to give that to the stadtholder, who didn't want a 10-foot picture of a man getting his eyes stabbed out by soldiers. But in any case, Rembrandt was very busy. This was a hugely successful period for him, leading up to the painting of the Night Watch. He had no time for, it seems, no time for a project that involved his continuing to use his much more detailed and finely finished manner of painting in order that the series would be consistent stylistically. And working on a small scale, I don't know, I think he, at that point, I don't think he perhaps felt he had so much more to gain by soliciting patronage from the stadtholder's court. But in any case, we don't really know. I'm just guessing at a few of the motives he might have had for delaying and making excuses and all that stuff, plus not getting paid. So he didn't, you know, they didn't send him money.
I think there was a piece of this question I didn't quite understand, and now I see. Were there a lot of studies? Did he do a lot of sketches and stuff for this?
Not very many for this. I showed one, but no. In fact, you know, there are surprisingly few studies, drawings, for the religious pictures or for history paintings in general with Rembrandt. Rembrandt seems to have done a good deal of working things out in the early stages of painting, which involved drawing with the brush, doing the layout, and then the lay-in of the various sequences of paint layers that built the painting up. So we have no good visual history of how this conception and this particular composition worked through from beginning to end, in the way we do with Rubens, for example.
I have another question, which is, this is just my own, I'm very curious. If I was living in Amsterdam during this time period when Rembrandt was actively painting, would I have been, did they have museums? Where would I be able to see these paintings, or were they just completely private, or how did that work?
No, that's also a really good question. Yeah, we assume museums, sure. But we didn't have public art museums in Europe until really until the time of the French Revolution and afterward. That was the great moment of realizing the Enlightenment ideal of spreading moral education and good manners to all classes, and opening up the royal collection to ordinary visitors, or at least visitors, as the British Museum put it, visitors with clean shoes. So there was a certain amount of, I suppose, well, anyway, there were some social niceties probably that needed to be observed, but otherwise, everyone was welcome. And the royal palaces were open, and this was such an impressive act on the part of the new French government after the revolution, that it was imitated by various right-minded and sovereigns in Germany and in Italy and so on. Yes, the private houses and collections in private buildings, city palazzi and villas and so forth. Those people could go around and look at those things if you had an introduction. And that meant if you belonged to a certain class of people that dressed well enough and behaved well enough. But to open the doors in a city palace to everybody was new. It didn't happen in Amsterdam until the 18th century. So anyway, where did you go to see Rembrandt? You couldn't go to the churches because the churches had abolished imagery, Protestant churches, and you might see them in fairs, public fairs, in other words, where there were stalls where sometimes art was displayed and sold, but it wasn't a very large scale. What you could do to see art was, generally speaking, go to artist studios, find out where they lived and go and visit. That's the primary place where artists, including Rembrandt, made his sales. And that's part of the cleverness Rembrandt exhibits in getting to Amsterdam and immediately making a deal with Hendrik Arlenburg. I mean, this was an important art dealer. And I don't doubt that Arlenburg's house had lots of Rembrandt that you could see on your way up to visit the studio. And you could buy, or you could commission. You could say, I like that, but, and so you heard me talk about some pictures of that kind. And I showed you a picture that seems to have been altered for the sake of the sensibilities of the buyer, or I'm talking about that Flora whose flowers cover up the head of a general whose head was cut off. You know, that sort of editing strikes us as just unbelievable and strange. But, you know, these were pictures that were made for sale. And it's not surprising to see that they got Baudelairized or got, you know, sort of edited to taste. And that would have happened in the artist studio, and probably at the behest of somebody who liked it, or wanted a Rembrandt, but just didn't, that head in a basket just didn't suit as decor. And I'm saying his, notice, I'm using his over and over again, because this is a male world, the Dutch art market. There was a couple of Dutch women painters, very fine ones, but on the whole, this was a trade practiced by male artists and patronized by male buyers. There were other places, public places, at a little later date, the City Hall, for example. We'll talk a lot about the City Hall. You'll see much more particularly, I think in the 5th lecture, I will be talking about the commissions that came to him for works that were not exactly totally public, but were meant for public consumption. Bought, in other words, by either individuals or groups, group portraits, and some historical paintings. One of his most important pictures was on view for the public to look at in City Hall, but not for very long, because they didn't really like it when they saw it up there, and it got taken down and cut up. You might get admission to the guild halls, that is the Surgeons Guild, for example, where there's the portrait that you saw that's now in the Mauritshuis, that anatomist doing the anatomy of an arm. If you could get into the upstairs headquarters of the Surgeons Guild, upstairs in that gatehouse building, you could see it. And I don't doubt that plenty of people did who were not doctors. If you could get access to the militia company headquarters, particularly if you could get into the so-called Kloveniersdoelen, you could see an incredible spectacle of large militia portraits of many men in various elegant or not so elegant poses by Rembrandt, by a lot of artists. And one by Rembrandt. The Night Watch was painted for a public, semi-public place, the militia headquarters, that presumably if you were of a class that would be welcome in that company, and these militia companies were a high-class thing, an amateur activity of well-to-do men, you could get in and see. I think that covers it. So forget about museums, but you have to use your charms. And I think you have to use your charm, but you can get to see privately owned pictures too.
Okay, thank you. I am going to address a couple of these questions myself. Stephanie asks why we didn't talk about the Hammer's portrait of a man in a black hat, and will it come up later in another talk? Yes, it will come up later in another talk. This is just part 1
Very
six-part
definitely. Oh, and
series.
I have some surprises for you about that picture.
So definitely tune in. We have two really great questions that are about lighting and technique. And we could get into that now if you'd like, or we could save it because I know that next week you're going to be talking in a lot of detail about those topics.
Yeah.
But I will read those to you in a second. I just want to ask you two other ones and then see if we still have
Yeah,
time.
please. Yeah, let's put off that. I think we're running maybe a little late. I don't know, but we may put that off. The question of lighting. That's a very interesting, very important question.
Yeah. Okay. So Aparna
Yeah.
and MM, I love these two questions and I will save these for next week. I hope
Yeah.
that's okay with you.
Good.
Excellent questions about his spotlight painting and why some areas are so dark and how he did that and why he was doing that. And then two more related questions. Roberto asks, how much of the Rembrandt bibliography, including the most recent stuff that came out in the last few years, is in Dutch? And I would like to add to that question, and I think this will be the last question for today. I would like to know if you could recommend some books on Rembrandt for our audience.
Great. Nothing of vital importance needs to be is in Dutch. The literature on Rembrandt has now become an English language thing. There are some catalogs that have been published rather perversely in Dutch only, but you don't have to worry about them. If you're interested in the literature, I'm going to give you 5 or 6 titles that I think you can get your hands on and are exceptionally important. So write these down, please. The two most fluent and entertaining writers about Rembrandt, also very knowledgeable. The top of the list, I think, is Gary Schwartz, Schwartz, Schwartz with a T, Z. The book that I think you should start with is Rembrandt's Universe. It came out in 2014 at Thames and Hudson. And at last I looked, there were still some new copies. In other words, it's in print. Another book that's easily gotten, and also still in print, 2 books actually, by Simon Schama, the British art historian become art historian, Schama. The one that came out first and is not about Rembrandt only, but about the whole art idea of art and art appreciation and everything else in Holland at the time. It was called The Embarrassment of Riches. And it's still in print in paper. And so is the book called Rembrandt's Eyes. So The Embarrassment of Riches and Rembrandt's Eyes. You can get them new, I think, for $30, $32 or so, but there are lots of used copies because luckily these were big press runs. And I don't know about you, but I depend on the used book market. And now, because everybody's holdings in Europe and America are pooled in effect electronically, you can use a service. Use Abebooks, one word, Abebooks, and you can find almost anything you want that's not too deeply rare or out of print. There is a book by Rosalind Ormiston, Ormiston, called Rembrandt Life and Work, which I haven't got hold of, which may be good. I don't know her either. So that's in print. And so is a new book just out by a curator at the Rijksmuseum called Jonathan Bikker, Bikker, and it's called Rembrandt Biography of a Rebel, and that's about $35. Now, if you want to spend some serious money on 2 really great and very new books, you want the book by Volker Manuth, Manuth, called Rembrandt, The Complete Paintings. It's a book put out by Taschen, the German publishers, 2019. $200, but it's got it all. And a comparable book have just come out on the etchings. The artist, the author whose name is on the title is Peter, Peter Schaatborn, Schatborn, Schatborn, Schaatborn. He was a curator at the Rijksmuseum. And Hinterding is the scholar now on Rembrandt etchings. It's called Rembrandt, the Complete Etchings. Also Taschen, $168.
So I just want to interrupt for one moment and say that our staff is typing the names of these books into the chat function. If you would like to get into the chat, you can see them if you didn't have a chance to write them down. I also want to put in a quick plug for supporting your local independent bookstore. Of course, if you need to buy it used and you want to get it through Abe Books, that's great. If you are going to purchase it new, I know that my favorite local bookstore, Essawan Books in Leimert Park, you can order any book from a local independent bookstore. Even if they specialize in one thing, they can usually special order any book you want. And I know that Vroman's in Pasadena has really been hurting and could use the extra business. And of course, the Hammer has our own wonderful, beautiful, award-winning bookstore, and you can order these books through our bookstore as well.
Yeah, and another West Side bookstore that needs your help is Diesel in Brentwood.
Bookstore, love that place.
Yeah, and they'll order anything, so you can get it. But the used, there's stuff you cannot get. If you can't get Gary Schwartz's book called Rembrandt's Universe, search on Gary Schwartz, The Rembrandt Book, which is also a comprehensive book done but 20 years earlier. And another book by him called The Complete Etchings of Rembrandt. These are much cheaper and you might be able to get them quicker. I don't know.
I also want to give a quick shout out to the extraordinary website that was created called RembrandtInSoCal.org. And it features all of these works of Rembrandt that are located in museums throughout Southern California. It's an amazing feat that all these curators came together and put together this beautiful website, and you can have virtual exhibitions and slideshows and see details of these works of Rembrandt. John, do you want to say anything else about that website?
Yeah, prime mover to make that fantastic website was Cynthia Burlingham, curator at the Hammer.
Wonderful, Cynthia Burlingham. She's also director of the Grunwald Center at the Hammer Museum. And I know she's out there watching today. So thank you for helping create that, Cynthia. And I guess that is it for today, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so please be sure to RSVP for the next one. Go ahead, John, sorry.
Yeah, keep coming back, please. It gets interesting and exciting in different ways, I promise.
This would normally cost thousands and thousands of dollars to attend one of the incredible universities that John has taught at. And we're very happy to be able to offer this amazing art history course for free at the Hammer Museum. So come back, and thank you for watching today. And thank you so much, John Walsh, for sharing your extraordinary body of knowledge with us. And it's just such a pleasure. I mean, frankly, if you were reading the phone book, I would still be entranced, but this is mind-blowing.
Maybe next year.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Goodbye. See you next week.